Okay, A1 versus A9 Mark II. I've tested them both and I have some thoughts. Let's just get into it right away. Hello everyone, my name is Magic. I'm a wedding photographer, Sony Europe ambassador, a father of 4 children, and welcome to this channel when I mostly talk about photography, weddings, gear, and stuff like that. So consider subscribing if you're into any of this. So yeah, 2 weeks ago I borrowed Sony A1 from Sony Poland, thanks Sony Poland, to test it out because I thought it's the perfect camera for me. But along with A1, I asked them to borrow me Sony A9 Mark II. So yeah, here are my thoughts. There are 3 sections here. I'm gonna be talking about the body differences, about sensor differences, and like what does it mean in terms of taking photos and performance, and then like additional features of the cameras. So speaking of the bodies itself, the cameras are like nearly identical. They have the same grip, they have the same size. Like when you take one of the other camera, you won't feel any difference at all. There are maybe 3 major, let's say, differences in the overall, design. So first one being card slots. So A1 has this new type of dual card slot type, so we can take either 2 SD cards or 2 CF Type A Express cards, or one of each actually, so we can mix this up as well, while A9 has only 2 SD UHS 2 slots. And what does that mean in like the actual performance of these 2 cameras? So since A1 is shooting this massive 50 megapixel files, so like 2 times size files from A9, clearing the buffer on the CF Type A Express cards, so on these fast cards, it's extremely fast. And what's really interesting, it's still faster than A9. Although A9 Mark II is pretty fast too, smaller files, even with the slower card, like slower than CF Type A, because I was using the fastest cards there are. It was not much behind. So what you see right now on the screen is both cameras clearing the buffers with raw compressed files, because that's what I use. A little mistake on my side, because A1 was clearing raw plus JPEG, but still that was faster than A9 is clearing only raw files, which actually confirms how fast the camera processing power is. But there's one but. When you use V90 cards on A1 camera, it will take slower to clear the buffer with raw files than A9 Mark II. That's due to the bigger file size. It's also not much behind, but still little behind A9 clearing the buffer with its smaller raw files. The second difference in terms of the camera build and the overall body design would be the electronical viewfinder, so EVF. A1 has this brand new design with a bigger viewfinder, better resolution, and faster frames, which gives you like super smooth experience while looking at the camera. So that is pretty nice change. The third difference would be new menu with like the touch operation, so you can actually use touch screen to change the things in the menu, which is pretty cool. And there are like some cosmetic changes in terms of like the top dial being a tiny bit different, like the left top dial. We have full HDMI on A1 instead of HDMI mini on A9 Mark II. Also the faster Wi-Fi and the power delivery via USB. And that concludes to me the differences between these 2 cameras, like in terms of body design and the input and outputs of the camera. So spec wise, obviously we are dealing with 30 frames per second at 50 megapixels versus 20 frames per second with 24 megapixels. And what does that mean in terms of how does that feel? Can you feel the difference? Yes, you can tell the difference that A1 is shooting faster. So I'm actually blown away with how fast A1 camera is, taking into account how massive files is shooting and how many megapixels it is dealing with. The question here is, do you need those 30 frames per second versus 20 frames per second? Like, how does that feel in terms of like, what's the difference? So here you can see two sequences of my wife running towards me. I shot this with 135 G Master lens with both cameras shooting burst. So you have this extra frames with A1 that I imagine if you're shooting, you know, high speed action like sports, maybe you are Roland Garros shooting Rafael Nadal hitting the ball, and that every frame will count here to have like the better photo in terms of, you know, the ball being in the frame and stuff like that. So there's certain use cases that you probably use those 30 frames per second. The question is, will actually you, the person that is looking to maybe get this camera, would use those 30 frames per second, as 20 frames per second still is plenty. And the obvious second advantage here of A1 being you have twice as many pixels. So you can crop in, you have a sharper image, you kind of zoom in twice, basically, like getting the same size of the image output at the end. So that is pretty insane. And I also can imagine many use cases to use both speed and those megapixels, maybe, you know, shooting wildlife when you're really far away from the subject, and every pixel will make a difference for you, and also speed will make a difference for you because, you know, the bird's gonna be flying super quick. So I can imagine that this might be very useful. And this leads me to a second point of the comparison between those two, which is the AF system. So what we're dealing with is 759 phase detection points on A1 versus 693 points on A9 Mark II, and A1 also is equipped with bird eye autofocus, which I did not check because it's just totally not the thing for me. And there's like this 120 autofocus calculations on A1 versus 60 on A9 Mark II. But like, what does like those differences mean in the real, you know, usage? So when shooting under good lighting conditions, I actually haven't noticed any differences between those two cameras. Like, both are extremely fast and accurate in the AF system. So subject running towards me, subject moving, basically like all the scenarios that I was, you know, testing out, both of the cameras were super capable of, you know, following the action. So probably, you know, the additional calculation comes down to serving those 30 frames per second. But I did found a scenario in which A1 was like a little bit faster than A9 Mark II, and that was when I was shooting in the dark at very high value of aperture, so like f16, f22, and A9 Mark II, I kind of had the feeling that it was searching a little bit, you know, eye autofocus was not that fast with like a moving subject. It was in complete darkness, and again, with the aperture stepped down to almost, you know, maximum. And there's a little tip as well, because I found that both of these cameras have an option to choose like how the aperture should work when you are working on these high values. So by default, Sony cameras work like this, that if you set your aperture to f22 while shooting, you know, the aperture will be closed for all the time while you're previewing the image in the viewfinder or on the screen, which you will see like in the actual image. You will see like the depth of field being, you know, very wide, and yeah, so you'll get that actual image of f22, and that comes with like a little bit of a, you know, losing a speed in terms of focusing. So like the moment of searching, I don't know if you have experienced that. Like me myself, I mostly shoot at wide open, but I have colleagues that shoot like f8, f11, and they said they were struggling with Sony cameras when it got dark shooting in these apertures because it was just taking slower. So A9 Mark II and A1, I don't know how many other cameras, A7R4 for sure as well, have this option called aperture drive. And when you set it to the focus priority, it will actually open up the aperture while previewing the image, but darkening the screen, so it's kind of pretends f22, but it doesn't actually show you the f22 image. And then the focus is extremely fast, is as fast as you'd be shooting wide open. So that's worth checking out if you are shooting one of these cameras and struggling with shooting at high aperture values. And speaking of shooting in the darkness, let's talk ISO performance of these two cameras. So obviously the A1 has twice as many pixels, so you'd expect the ISO not to be as great as A9 Mark II, and my tests would confirm that. So I was only working with like the RAWs in the Imaging Edge software, which is not my preferred software to check things out, but you can definitely see the advantage of A9 Mark II at ISOs like 3200 or 6400. But A1 still performs pretty well. I'll be super honest with you, I'm not an expert of an ISO, comparisons. I like looking at my final image, so, edit it, maybe take some noise reduction and see if this is usable to me with the moment that it's in the photo and the light and so on and so on. But if you are that pixel peeper, in the description, you will find the files, RAWs from A7R3, A1 and A9 Mark II. And speaking of like the capabilities of A1 and A9 Mark II in terms of shooting, is that A1 can sync with flash at faster shutter speed, which is 1/400 of a second, and if you even change to crop mode, it can sync at 1/500 of a second. So that's something I did not check because I have no use case for that. But since we're comparing these two, this is something that A1 has and A9 Mark II does not. So in my eyes, that kind of concludes all the photo ability features of these two cameras. So that's at least everything that I see those cameras can do while shooting and the differences between those two. There are a few other major differences with other stuff. So A1 has a massive movie mode with 8K 40 frames per second, 4K 120, while A9 has only 4K 30 frames per second. A1 has 10-bit 422 with 16 raw output if you want to do external recording, while A9 has only 8-bit 420. And also A1 has picture profiles like S-Log3, S-Cinetone, and again A9 has none of these. So basically, if we're comparing movie, capabilities of these two cameras, A1 definitely hits home here, and A9 just wasn't meant for video. So let's try to sum this up. If you're about to buy a camera purely for photo taking, and you want the fastest of the fastest camera you have, those two are on pair in terms of the performance, AF system and so on, with A1 having slight advantage in terms of shooting in the darkness. Then of course A1 has this 10 additional frames per second, but there's very niche I'd say use cases for that. So most of the time you'd be rather happy with 20 frames per second. And then of course megapixels. So A1 has more, A9 has less. But again, you might not need 50 megapixels. So if you're after a very fast camera and 24 megapixels is enough for you, A9 might be better choice for you, as it's twice cheaper. But if you want anything more from this camera, so if you want shoot videos as well and have like more options there. If you want to shoot studio stuff, you know, wildlife stuff, when you're gonna need those more megapixels as well as all the speed. The A1 is the only one that have it all. And that actually makes me think that Sony nailed this camera in terms of how they wanted it to be and what it actually is. So the whole idea, the one that will be as fast in terms of performance as A9, as good in terms of video capabilities as A7S III, and you know, as good in terms of megapixels as A7R4, and it actually is everything and even more than all of these three cameras, with A9 having only one advantage over this camera, being ISO performance and maybe a smaller file. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about this. Like, did you enjoy this comparison? Let me know if I missed something. I'll be having more chances to play with these cameras later on, and happy to answer all the questions as always. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next one. Bye bye.